Welcome. My name is John Gatta. I'm the CEO of ECRA Group. For those of you that don't know, ECRA is a national research and analytics firm that helps school districts document performance and communicate performance through analytic services and evidence-based practices. And so today I wanted to talk a little bit about how do you extract positive headlines from Wisconsin report card data. The Wisconsin state report cards will be dropping soon, and so this webinar is to get you to think a little bit differently about how you might message that data when that data is released. And this presentation is about being more positive, but also being more credible at the same time. So my career has been in helping organizations be more sophisticated about their data use so that they can be more credible and more positive at the same time. And what I've learned over my career is if you can be a little bit more sophisticated about how you interface with data, one of the side effects of that is not only that it's more credible, but it's also more positive. And so that's really the focus of today's presentation. So I'm going to go through some examples. I'm going to motivate the idea up front, and then walk through how you can access some of the techniques that I'm describing in this presentation. We are also a partner of WASDA as well, and so at the end of this presentation, there's a special offer that we are offering participants of this webinar in terms of gaining access to this data. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started. So we're going to talk a lot today about how to use percentiles for context to tell a more credible and positive story. And so the idea here is to transition your thinking away from raw metrics to percentiles. And the reason for that is percentiles, they have three great properties that make it really great for communicating, especially state report card data. One is that they're simple, right? Everybody understands percentiles intuitively, and so that it's a nice property because very little explanation is needed to the audience to make sure that they're understanding things the way that you want them to. Two is that they're contextual and that they situate performance against a backdrop of what's typical and atypical, adding context to data. I'm going to talk a little bit about that and give some examples. And then the last piece is that it's comparable. When you think about the state of Wisconsin report card, there's a lot of metrics that get released, but how do we compare metrics so that we can look at strengths and weaknesses, and we can also extract storylines or headlines that sort of tell in a better way who we are as a school district, and sort of echo the kinds of headlines that we want people talking about. And so one of the ways I want to motivate this is just through percentiles overall. And so one of the examples I like to give is from pediatrics. And so for those of you that are parents in the audience today, is, you know, if you have a son or daughter and maybe they're born and they're 7 pounds 8 ounces, and then you go back to the pediatrician, then they're 12 pounds, you go back later on, they're 18 pounds, 22 pounds, so on and so forth, right? That is a very understandable metric in a sense, right? Height and weight are easy to understand. But what's the first question that you ask as a parent? The first question I ask is that normal, right? What is normal, and is my son or daughter growing at rates that I would have expected? So even in metrics such as height and weight, it's really difficult to contextualize what the data means unless you situate it against a backdrop of what's typical or atypical. And certainly that's the case with state report card data, whose metrics are even more abstract than things like height and weight. And so one of the ways I want to also talk about this is in terms of, and you know, this happens across the nation. Wisconsin's no different, but this phenomenon happens in Wisconsin as well, is that the assessments that students take as part of the state assessment program, right, there's a layer of policy sort of layered on top of those assessments. And so the way that it works, right, is students take state exams, they get scores, but then committees or policy at the state level draw lines in the sand in terms of what it means to be proficient or advanced or whatever categories the state is using. And typically, now this changes depending on what year or what grade level or what subject, but generally speaking, what's typical in Wisconsin is about 40% of students are proficient in math, and this is just as an example. And so if you took that at face value, right, the headline for that isn't very positive, because a lot of people would take that data and they would say, wow, in Wisconsin less than half the kids are at grade level. That's not so great. But if you were to look at that in terms of percentiles on NAEP, NAEP is the National Assessment of Educational Progress. So if you were to look at Wisconsin's performance on that, and I just took grade 8 because NAEP is only grades 4 and grade 8. And so for this math example, turns out that even though 40% of students are proficient in math, according to the state program, if you were to look at that in terms of national performance on NAEP, they're almost at the 90th percentile. And so there's a disconnect there between the sort of raw metrics reported on report cards and how competitive Wisconsin students are. So that motivates the idea of using percentiles to add context and to tell a more credible and positive story. And the last piece is that they're comparable. So there's lots of metrics that are reported on the Wisconsin State report card. But so how do you compare them? Because they're all reported on different metrics. Well, if you convert everything to percentiles, then it's easier to compare and it's easier to extract storylines from your data. And so the rest of the webinar here, I'm going to go through a few examples using the ECRA Wisconsin report card analysis, which is an analysis that ECRA does by taking all of the available data from the State Department. We suck all that data down, we analyze all the data across the state, and then we look at everybody's performance, each school district's performance, through the lens of how they sort of stack up against districts across the state. And so the report compares 2022 to 2023 using state percentiles, and it also offers you an opportunity to add some qualitative data and notes. And so the idea here is when your report cards hit, and it comes time to start explaining this to your Board of Education and generating presentations or reports to put in board packets, this is analysis that we do. It comes in a PDF format that you can put right into the board packet, and you can present right off of it at your board meetings, and even add some qualitative notes to. And so let's do 3 examples working through this report, and it showcases how transitioning from raw metrics to percentiles might help you tell a more credible and positive story at the same time. So what I'm doing here is just lifting off of pages of this report, right? And so the first example I'm going to do is looking at proficiency. And this is real data from a real school district in Wisconsin for 2022. This is not 2023 data. That will be released really soon here. But the report will compare two school years. And so I'm going to take this example, and all I'm doing with this example is reading the data directly off of one of the lines in the report. And so if you were to take the proficiency reported from Wisconsin for a real school district, you'd find that in this particular school district, 58% of students are proficient or advanced on Wisconsin math standards, right? And so that, again, at face value, might be interpreted a variety of ways, some of which might not be as credible or as positive as you'd like. But it turns out if you were to convert 58% proficient on state standards, that corresponds to the 92nd state percentile, right? And so that tells a much different story, right? So if you consider 2 potential headlines that might come from that data, if you were just to release the raw data, a headline might read, latest test results for 2022 reveal only 58% of students are proficient in math, right? That's accurate, right? But it's not as contextualized, and it certainly doesn't reflect the great work that's happening in school districts across Wisconsin, and it doesn't really contextualize it to a point where there's a better understanding or a more intuitive understanding of what that actually means. So if you take the same exact data, right, but just convert the metric to a percentile, the headline reads much different. The headline would read, District ABC outperforms 92% of school districts in Wisconsin in mathematics proficiency based on latest test results. So all we did here is introduce a benchmark and converted raw metrics to percentiles, and so that it's simpler to communicate, they're more contextualized, and they're comparable. And so you can see by simply converting that raw metric of proficiency to a percentile, you wrote a more credible headline and you wrote a more positive headline all at the same time, just by focusing on percentiles as opposed to percents. Let's use another example right off the report card and right off the analysis that ECRA provides, and this time looking at target group achievement. So it's a similar kind of story here in that if you were to just lift the data from the report card and your score was 30, again, this is real data, for the target group achievement score, it turns out that's at the 87th state percentile. So again, by introducing a benchmark, by converting a raw metric to a percentile, things become simpler, they become more contextualized, and they become more comparable. And so now, instead of our headline reading that district scores 30 out of 100 in helping low-performing students, our headline becomes district ABCs in the top 13% of the state for target group achievement. Just to be redundant for the sake of making the point is, all we did here is we took the raw metric, introduced a benchmark in terms of the state, and focused our communication away from the raw metric to the percentile. And in doing so, we wrote a more credible headline and we wrote a more positive headline at the same time. The last example I want to give is academic return on investment. So one of the properties of percentiles that I mentioned is that they're comparable. So on the Wisconsin State Report Card, there's a lot of metrics, some of which are achievement-based, some of which are financial-based, and there's a variety of other metrics as well. Well, it's really difficult to compare raw metrics when they're on different scales, right? But if you convert everything to a percentile, then everything's on the same scale. And once everything's on the same scale, you can start to extract different storylines by comparing performance on one kind of indicator versus another indicator. And the example I want to give is looking at financial relative spending to relative performance and proficiency. And so by comparing a financial indicator and a academic indicator, we can start to build a headline or a story around academic return on investment. And all I'm doing here is lifting the percentiles right off of the ECRA State Report Card analysis. And in doing so, if we were to use the raw metrics contained in this report or just released by the State Department, the raw metric might be that $11,990 per student for total current education costs per student, right? And that district has 58% students proficient in math. So those two numbers alongside each other are sort of hard to combine to tell a story, right? But if you convert both of them to percentiles, all of a sudden a story starts to emerge, because that 11,990 corresponds to the 26th percentile, but that 58% corresponds to the 92nd percentile, right? And so when you think about how you might message this data, the comparison of headlines, if you were just to focus on the raw metrics, might read something like, despite spending nearly $12,000 per student, only 58% of students are at grade level in math. That's not so positive, but it's also not credible in the sense that it is, there's no context to those numbers. It's really hard to understand what the real meaning of those numbers are. But if we, again, convert them to percentiles, now our headline is more credible and more positive. And so now our headline becomes, while the district's total current education cost per student is less than 26% of districts, students' math proficiency is in the top 8% of the state. And so now we're looking at relative spending versus relative performance, and you're able to extract a headline that as a school district, we're spending far less than what's typical across the state, but we're getting performance that's far above what's typical. And all of this is facilitated through the use of percentiles. And so the takeaway here is, when you start to communicate your report card data, and when the report card data drops in Wisconsin, really start thinking about moving away from the raw metrics of percent and start interpreting and communicating percentiles that have those properties, again, of being they're simpler, they're more contextualized, and they're comparable.